would you like to introduce?
Yeah, thank you very much for joining to these 7 awareness panels. As you know, this is a forum for discussion, and I am very happy to introduce and to have you all here. And thank you very much also for accepting the invitation. Today, we are going to talk about data portability, a very hot topic. So we are going to talk about the integration of the notion in the legal framework, and we have 3 outstanding speakers. First of all, let me introduce you to Denise Amram, that she is a member to the Sant'Anna, and she's going to talk about the data portability right under the GDPR, and which are the limits and opportunities. Second, and thank you very much for joining us, allow me to introduce Mc Kibbin, that he has joined from the University of Ghent, and he is going to enlighten us about the interplay between the GDPR data portability right and the European strategy for data. And he is going to focus on the Data Governance Act and the Data Act. And third, Tommaso, he's going to conclude, and he's also a member from the Sant'Anna team. And he's going to talk about the interplay, about the GDPR with regard to the data portability, but he's going to focus on the specific data access framework of the Open Data Directive and the Free Flow on Non-Personal Data Directive. So thank you very much for your kind participation, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Magali, for the organization. Very briefly, since we are a bit in delay, as anticipated, I'm assistant professor at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, and I'm part of the SoBigData project for the Sant'Anna team, and we are dealing with the ethical legal issues related to these new opportunities to develop research, starting from data mining analysis that are going to be accessible, interoperable, findable, and reusable. So in fact, the SoBigData project has been recently approved in terms of research infrastructure, and so our job is going to be continued in terms on how to boost the data strategy for research, scientific research. Today we are going to talk about data portability. Very short introduction to data portability in GDPR. Data portability is one of the new rights that have been introduced from the regulation on the general data protection in 2016 and entered into force in 2018. And I divided the Article 20 into different slides in order to highlight which are the limits and the opportunities that the new provision is addressing in terms of data protection, but also in terms of boosting the research data and more in general the circulation of information for further uses. Article 20 states that data subjects shall have the right to receive the personal data concerning her, which she has provided to the controller earlier, perhaps for other purposes. How? In a structured, common use and machine readable format. And the data portability is composed also of another right included in this first part related to receive data that have been already collected by the data controller. That is the right to transmit the dataset to another controller without hindrance from the controller to which the personal data have been provided. So in this first part of the first paragraph, we have a definition of data portability that is composed of two parts. The first part is to receive that data that have been already collected, and the second part that is to be able to transmit them to another data controller. And on the other side, we have references to the technical interoperability of the information, of the flow that is enabled with the data portability. In fact, dataset shall be readable to the other data controller. And we have also a reference to, we can say, an organizational interoperability. So the fact that barriers shall not be opposed to this kind of request. So each organization, each data controller shall introduce mechanisms in order to allow, without barriers, without obstacles, the exercise of this kind of right from the data subjects. Interoperability. So portability is very, very related to interoperability. Let's see if I can move the slide out. If I can, okay. The second part of the first paragraph of the GDPR. So what is the legal basis? What is the legal interoperability? So the dimension that enables the possibility to transfer this kind of information from a data controller to another one. From a legal perspective, the legal basis that enable this kind of data processing should be the consent and or the contract. So it is impossible to submit a request of data portability if the legal basis that enabled the data processing in the first data collection was, for example, the public interest or the legitimate interest. Another element that is required for the exercise of data portability is the fact that data processing shall be carried out by automated means. So non-automated means of this kind of data processing cannot cannot create the organizational measures in order to allow this kind of transfer of data set from a data controller to another one. So in this part, we can identify the legal requirements from a legal basis perspective, and the fact that it is necessary that this operation shall be automatized. The second paragraph of Article 20 of the GDPR states that this kind of right can be exercised by requesting data collected to the data controller and ask to, in order to transfer the data set to another data controller, but it can also be a request to directly send the data from a controller to another one when it is technically feasible. What is the meaning of technically feasible? Well, we come back to the definition of, we can say, technical interoperability, the fact that the dataset is structured, used, and machine readable format, so it can be readable to the second data controller. Limits. Limits are described in paragraphs 3 and 4. So we said that legal basis shall be necessary, the consent or the contractual clauses for the to enable this kind of right. And there are some balances that this kind of right shall be shall deal with. And firstly, it shall deal with the right to be forgotten that prevails on the right to portability. So if the data subject asked to be forgotten, then he can't ask to receive and then to send her data to another data controller. And it is not applicable if the legal basis that for the data processing, data collection of the data set is referred to public interest or exercising of official authority. And more in general, there is a general clause to balance the request of data portability with other rights and freedoms of third parties that shall not be in any way affected. This is a general picture of the view of the data portability in the GDPR. If you have any questions or doubts, please do not hesitate to contact me. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Denise, for your presentation. Allow me to maybe to say something that I didn't mention before, and my apologies for that. Normally, as you know, we keep the questions to the end, but at this moment, as Denise, she will have to leave us in some moment. Maybe if you have any questions to her, we can take up some minutes to discuss it. Okay, I may have a question, Denise. I am a little concerned about, I mean, what are the, as you mentioned very well that we have the data portability, but what happens, for example, when this data has been elaborated? I'm thinking more specifically on, I don't know, the results or the data used that had been used for example, clinical trials, that then this data had been elaborated. So it is kind of a derived data, but still one can identify the person putting together. If in these cases, one can still exercise the data portability with regard to this derived data.
Well, when you arrive to the step to be able to reuse data for clinical trials, as you mentioned, but also in other kind of scientific domains, well, the first step is to pseudonymize data. The second step is to delete the key of association as soon as possible. So I think that if your data are still pseudonymized, the data subject may ask for the data portability by and exercising this right, and it is up to the data controller to identify the ID and give the data set as pseudonymized line to be used for other uses. On the other side, if the key of reassociation between the nickname and the identification of the data subject has been deleted, there is no more the possibility, the technical possibility to make the data portability possible. So in that case, the data controller can say, I have anonymized the data set and I cannot anymore give you the information that I process it for research purposes, as I told you in the information privacy. So the first compliance activity is to inform on which are the means, the purposes, and also the different steps of the data processing in order to make the data subjects aware of also the delay in which they can exercise their rights. I don't know if I was...
Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm very sorry I need to leave, and I will connect on my mobile. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's pass the floor to our second speaker. As I introduced before, Mr. Kibbin, sorry. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Ghent. So the floor is all yours.
Everyone see my screen fine?
Yes, maybe you can make it bigger, like
I
share
will,
the
yeah.
screen.
People. Oh, sorry. Okay. So today I will be discussing the interplay between the GDPR's data portability right and the European strategy for data, with a focus on the Data Governance Act and the Data Act. So where Denise was mostly discussing the right itself, I will mostly be focusing on kind of the challenges that arise when data subjects go to exercise the right to data portability. So starting from the beginning, just real briefly, Article 20 of the GDPR gives data subjects the right to receive personal data, which he or she has provided in a structured, commonly used machine-readable format. And they also have the right to have that transmitted directly from one controller to another where it is technically feasible. Recital 68 further elaborates that in addition to being structured, commonly used, machine readable, that should be in an interoperable format, and that data controllers should be encouraged to develop these interoperable formats. But it does not create an obligation for data controllers to adopt or maintain processing systems which are technically compatible, which will be important later on. So the first problem that arises here is what is commonly used in machine readable format, which some of the examples the Article 29 Working Party guidelines give are like a playlist from Spotify that you could then transfer to Apple Music, simple data sets like that. But we know that in practice, data is much more complicated than that. And especially when the GDPR doesn't actually impose any specific recommendations on the format that data ought to be. The Working Party recommends that direct transmission should be, of the overall data set, which would be a CSV format that might look like Microsoft Excel, or through an automated tool, which might read the data and translate it itself. But we can also see in practice, the court case down here, Ola Cab's app, which was a court case in the Netherlands, that when a data subject actually went to request their personal data in a specific file format, the court rejected this and said that the GDPR does not automatically imply an obligation to put it in a particular format, and that especially given the amount of data that they were collecting, they did not need to basically conform to the expectations of the data subjects about how to transmit it. The second problem is how should a data subject actually know what data they need provided? So the object of the Data Portability Act is to transfer personal data from one service provider to another. So in order to do that, you have to have some sense of what data you would like to transfer and what data they might have that could be useful in that context. In theory, all of this should be disclosed in the privacy policy, but we all know in practice that the privacy policy is not always as clear as it should be. And it might not necessarily be presented in a way that is easy for the data subject to understand. What the Article 29 Working Party guidelines say is that it should be interpreted broadly, but what it does not include is inferred data or derived data. And so that leaves open this really difficult question of where we draw the line between what is observational, what is behavioral, what is observed data, and what is our data that are inferences created by the data processor. And again, looking back at this court case in the Netherlands, which is not necessarily controlling in all the European Union, but is an important guideline here, is that if you cannot request necessarily all personal data under Article 20 because the scope of that data is very wide and it's not necessarily clear to the controller what data they actually need to provide you, particularly if you're intending to have it transmitted directly to another controller. And then the third problem, how does the data subject transfer data from one controller to another without a compatibility obligation? the GDPR itself, as well as the Article 29 guidelines, make it clear that there's this difference between compatibility and interoperability. So while you might need to put, or you should put your data into an interoperable format, one that could be read by other controllers, it doesn't necessarily have to be compatible, and controllers don't have an obligation to make it compatible. So the confusing part here is that kind of leaves this difficult situation for data subjects who are stuck between two competitors who might not necessarily want you to switch ecosystems. It may be the case that they're incentivized to retain more data than necessary, because often metadata can reveal trade secrets. It can reveal information that they wouldn't necessarily want competitors to know. And there's no requirement regarding quality. So in terms of, how the data are annotated, what they actually look like, besides, accuracy, which is required by GDPR, you might be receiving a collection of data that is not really all that useful, or you might be sending one that's not really all that useful. So these are the three questions to summarize. What is a commonly used machine readable format? How does the data subject know what data he or she has provided? And how does the data subject transmit to another controller without a compatibility obligation? So basically, broad strokes here, the Data Act is making data portability possible. So it is in many ways solving these technical challenges that have occurred based on the ambiguities in the GDPR, whereas the Data Governance Act is making it more practical, which has to do with this connection between how complicated data processing activities are and what the data subject actually understands. So when we're looking at the Data Act, there are mainly four articles that I think are the most relevant here. Data Act is quite large, and there obviously are articles where we're dealing with non-personal data, as well as articles dealing with the special data spaces they'll set up, like the health data space. And those kind of will all influence data portability, but just for the sake of this presentation, we're going to focus on the ones that affect personal data. So that's Article 23, 24, 26, and 29. So Article 23 puts a requirement on data processing service providers to take measures to actually ensure that customers of their service can switch to another data processing service or type. It also requires them to remove commercial, technical, contractual obstacles, which would prevent customers from switching between services. Article 24 creates a contractual clause in this important mandatory 30-day switching period, where the data controller is actually expected to help the data subject switch services and to kind of facilitate that switching and be on call for them to help them. And to also add an additional disclosure that would apply along with the GDPR, which is more specific information about the data created, personal and non-personal, created by the customer, including metadata, just to potentially make it easier to understand. Article 26 requires data controllers to, or providers of data processing service to make open interfaces publicly available. That's how their systems operate, and ensure compatibility with open interoperability specifications, which is pretty important, which we'll talk about in Article 29. But basically, the Data Act leaves open this possibility for the European Union to create various interoperability standards. And then Article 26 makes it mandatory for data service providers to adopt these interoperability specifications. And then, Article 29 goes into detail about what those interoperability standards should include, including, they must enhance portability and, where technically feasible, allow for users to switch between data processing services. So going back to our original questions here, we can kind of see what this does and does not do. So in terms of what is commonly used in machine readable format, well, we still don't have an exact answer about what a commonly used in machine readable format may be, or what is necessary in any given situation. But we do have a new requirement that data controllers have to ensure compatibility with open interoperability specifications. So the idea is that as long as the language the two controllers are speaking in is interoperable, that they're using some sort of common standard, it should be easier for for data subjects exercising their rights to transfer data from controller A to controller B. Unfortunately, the default is still a structured, commonly used in machine readable format, which is language that's not necessarily very specific, not necessarily that helpful. But it does do something in the way of helping us reach some sort of standard format. And they also must take active measures to ensure effective switching, which I think is different than under GDPR, which says, it kind of encourages it rather than under the Data Act, it becomes kind of an active requirement. Regarding the second question, how does the data subject know what he or she has provided? It includes the clearest help here is that it provides additional specifications, additional disclosures that should, in theory, make it easier for data subjects to know which data needs to be ported and which data does not. It includes the mandatory 30-day assistance period and contractual clause, which means that they have to assist data subjects. So even if it's not immediately clear what data they might want ported, they should be able to work with the data controller to have the correct information ported so switching becomes an actual option. And finally, in the third question, how does the data subject transmit data without a compatibility obligation? It puts in place what is close to a compatibility obligation. So first, it's that making your open interface publicly available means other organizations, even if you don't want it to be compatible with another data controller, if you make your interface publicly available, then perhaps they can take measures themselves to make your systems compatible. And then finally, removing obstacles to portability, which I think just a bit essentially amounts to this idea that if you are providing data processing services, you're incentivized to work along with other data processing services to make sure that you're portable within your industry as required by the regulation. So next, we're going to look at the Data Governance Act. The Data Governance Act is a bit simpler. It provides, how the Data Governance Act is less relevant here. It has to do with the reuse of data from public bodies. What we're really focusing on is these two separate organizations that the Data Governance Act kind of creates here. So the first is Data Intermediary Services. Basically, it creates a registration system for this new type of entity called a Data Intermediary Service. And they act as one of the specific purposes of such an organization would be to help data subjects exercise their rights under the GDPR. And basically they're allowed to perform this, and as long as they're a separate entity from other sort of digital services. So in order to minimize conflicts of interest, they have to act in the best interest of the data subject, and they can only change the format to facilitate interoperability, which is the general idea is that they are not the ones processing data for their own purposes. They're merely acting as a kind of a conduit between organizations on behalf of the data subject. The other organization it creates, which is more relevant to the area of kind of health research or different types of public service organizations that might be donating data, or data altruism organizations. And what the regulation effectively does is create a common consent form to make it easier to get general consent to have people sign up for this, which in the preamble to the regulation, they mentioned should allow help facilitate data portability, because it would create kind of a standard data processing agreement that should be easier from organization controller A to controller B to understand, as well as for the data subject themselves to understand what data are being collected. And the requirements for this data altruism organization are a bit stricter, though, and they have to be a nonprofit, basically formed to meet some sort of objective in the public interest, and they must conduct their activities in a legally independent structure. So going back to our questions, we see that essentially the common theme here is that if you have some sort of data intermediation service, it eliminates kind of this problem where the data subject doesn't necessarily know the technical requirements, doesn't necessarily know the type of data they need to in order to switch services. So in theory, these data intermediation services should allow users to switch services easier. It should allow communication between data controllers to be a bit easier, and hopefully eliminate this idea of competition. So when you have two organizations competing to collect the data of an individual data subject, it is in theory much better off to have an intermediation service looking out for the data subject and kind of serving as a buffer between those two competitors in the marketplace, so that the switching is more likely to happen. It's more likely to be technically possible, and there should be someone who is with expertise to explain to the data subject how that switching should look and what data they might possibly need. The main thing that isn't really addressed, though, is how this compatibility obligation, but I think with the Data Act in connection to this, that an intermediary again should kind of help in some way to make that easier. The main problems with the Data Governance Act are, well, these are just registration notification requirements for specific entities. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be created. It doesn't necessarily mean this is a feasible business model. It all sounds well and good that we would have these organizations helping data subjects exercise their rights, but as far as we know, that's not a good business model at all. Even if it's not a business model per se, and we're looking at data altruism organizations, it could still be a matter of people not volunteering, as users not wanting to use these services even when they exist. In theory, they might create more trust. We might have a better conduit for people to donate data, but we don't actually know. We don't know if these organizations are mandatory for data controllers. The GDPR says that they must make it possible, if technically feasible, to move data directly between to another data controller. But it's nothing to do with that, the direction of the data subject or what the data subject's wishes are. So perhaps many organizations may choose to transfer data without going through one of these organizations. And it's interesting to say, how much do these really add when considering the new requirements under the Data Act, the new disclosures, the new, especially the mandatory 30-day kind of helping period for switching services. If you're already having an organization help you exercise your right to data portability required by law, then how much is it really adding to have another intermediary help you there? So that's everything now, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mc Kibbin. If you agree, I will keep the format and I will pass the floor to Tommaso Crepax. Tommaso is, as I said before, he's a member to the Sant'Anna school, and he's specifically a PhD candidate of our LEADS program. As you know, this is a joint LEADS and SoBigData project. So he will talk, as I said before, about the interplay between the GDPR data portability in the specific data framework of the Open Data Directive and the free flow of non-personal data. So thank you to Tommaso once more.
Thank you very much, Magali, for introduction, and thank you very much to the other speakers. Well, today what I'm going to talk about is a thing that we've been hearing a lot from mostly data scientists, that, they always say that the law is always an obstacle. When they talk about GDPR, it's an obstacle to their research. Well, what I would like to say today is that it's not always like that. I would say that the prayers of data scientists have been heard. So the European Commission and the legislator, they are listening to what data scientists are saying, that they need more data. And I'm going to talk about how the law can really help you data scientists in opening up situations where you can use more data, different data access regimes, and both as you as professional users of digital services on one hand, that we're going to talk about to the free flow of personal data regulation, and on the other side as individual users of data set that have been created in the with services in the public sector. So we're going to talk also a bit of problems that it's in the accessing of this information and using of this information, and we'll draw a few conclusions too. Now, what we've really been discussing so far is basically the beginning of the story of data portability with Denise and the GDPR, how it was created, and with Mc Kibbin, with Kyle, we discussed how basically is the happy ending of the story. And I'm squeezed between these two because I have to talk about what happened afterwards, GDPR, and in between GDPR and the Data Act, which kind of opened everything to not even to portability, but to interoperability of all sorts of data. Now, what data are we talking about? When we're talking about data reuse to foster innovation, to data-driven innovation, and to database societies, we're talking about two types of information. On one hand, we have private information and public information. With private information, we have personal data, and the free flow of which is one of the biggest aim of GDPR. And what we haven't been discussing so far is the free flow of non-personal data, which is basically data that are pertaining to businesses, and all data that is not personal. On the other hand, we have public information, which are held by public sector bodies or public undertakings And these data are like, again, public, but we need access to those. Let's first talk about free flow of non-personal data. Well, for the free flow of non-personal data, we have an article in the free flow of non-personal data regulation. Mind that it's a regulation, not a directive. That said, that's called porting of data. So now the aim of the free flow of non-personal regulation is to basically remove the obstacles to data mobility. Now, data mobility is hindered by two important things. One is data localization requirements that has to do with member states having requirements on where can you use the data, where can you access the data, where can you port the data, and so on and so forth. This one we're not going to talk about. The other one is very important, that is in the private sector, and that's related to vendor lock-ins. Now, vendor lock-ins, these days here at UniP, we have a problem with Google Workspace for education. Google Workspace basically gave us the chance to use 100 gigabytes for free for education, and our people at UniP are using this 100 gigabytes of data. Only they went a little bit overboard and they used 472 gigabytes of this data. Now, Google is saying, okay, guys, it's fine that you use them, but you should get back to the 100 gigabytes that we gave you license to use these for. So now we have a problem that before January, we have to basically either like delete all the data or port all the data, download all the data, that we cannot use the access, the drivers of Google Workspace anymore. So this is a big problem. And it can also happen to you as professional users. So do you have a right to ask Google as professional users of their services to port all your data, that it's non-personal? If you were personal, you have GDPR Article 20 to use it. But this time you don't have that. Now, do you really have a right to data portability of non-personal data? Not really. So the article says that the Commission shall encourage and facilitate the development of codes of conducts. And these codes of conducts are basically self-regulatory means. They have to be kind of, there's a principle-based approach, but the European Commission did not say, okay, guys, you need to use this and this type of formats. You do not have to use machine readable and so on and so forth. The principles shall be those of transparency and interoperability in the development of these codes of conducts. And basically what they're asking for is the development of best practices to create the means to do switching from providers, from one provider to the other, so providers of digital services, and the porting of the data from one provider to the other. Yet again, there's no right to portability. There's only the chance, and also the Commission shall encourage small and medium enterprises, professional users, individuals, to take part in these, to be part in this development, closed circles of development of these codes of conducts. Now, is this really like, really your prayers being heard? Not so much, but I mean, just so you know, you can be part of this development of code of conduct circles, and if that's not happening, well, yeah, you can ask the Commission in some sort of ways. As for the codes of conduct, there's a few key aspects of the porting. And when you're developing this code of conduct, you have to take into consideration the data backups, availability of data formats, required IT configuration, minimum network bandwidth, time for initiating the porting, what happens when the data is not available anymore, how long can it be available for, what happens if the business goes bankrupt. So there's a lot of things that you have to take into consideration when developing this code of conduct. Now, I'm just checking the timing here. Now, moving to the part of public data now. So we're leaving the part of individual data that is both personal and let's say professional, not so non-personal data. We move now to the public side. When we move to the public side, we have the Open Data Directive. This is 2019, so we were 2018 free flow non-personal data, and now 2019 with the Open Data Directive. Now, the aims of the Open Data Directive is to foster the use of open data formats, so open data formats and open data standards. Now, it does so through a few means. So on the one hand, it has to making available for reuse of, they call it documents, but basically it's data sets that are created by public sector bodies in the exercise of their public functions. Making available of documents held by public undertakings, which are normal undertakings that are dominated by other public sector bodies, which basically provide their services in the general interest. That is, for instance, businesses that do water supply, energy, transportation, air transportation, postal services, all these sorts of undertakings, they do have a general public interest. So the data that they create and the documents they create in the exercise of these functions, they also should be made available for reuse. Now, what are these data that these public sector bodies have? We're talking about data about like social, political nature, economic, legal, geographical, seismic data, transportation data, seismic meteorological data. So all these sorts of data that are being created by public sector bodies, you as even professional users or like as users, as data scientists or researchers, have sort of like a right to have them made available for you. So it is a directive. So it obliges the member state to take measures so that the public sector data that they create are available for you as users. But not all countries have implemented these regulations already. So call for action, go and check how has this Open Data Directive be translated in your own country. And for what regards public undertakings, they also don't have the obligation to make this data available, but they somewhat have to if you do request it. And then they have a reasonable, I mean, they can have legitimate reasons for not giving you access to this data. But that's, again, that's sort of like an exception. Now, there's also a part in relation to research data. So that's the third thing that this Open Data Directive does. About research data, and when we talk about research data, we are talking about like statistics, results of experiments, observations, measurements, also metadata specification, and all these things that have been created in the exercise of research. So we're not talking about the end result of the research, such as scientific paper, for instance, but the data that you use to get to the scientific paper, to the publication of that paper. Now, Article 10 of Open Data Directive does the following. It obliges member states to adopt legislations that somewhat foster open access policies. The idea is that any type of research that is done through public funding shall be open access. So the mantra here is as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And when we talk about necessities, we mean closeness that's related to either technical constraints, such as interoperability problems, compatibility problems, this API not working in the way in which it should be, or even legal problems. With legal problems, we think of, for instance, what if I make a request to the public sector body to get access to dynamic data, which are data that are being collected in real time, and they don't give me access to this real-time data, but they wait too long, for instance, for me to access seismic data or data related to sensors on CO2 level in the city. These are like legal burdens and legal closeness obstacles that shall be removed thanks to this Open Data Directive. Now, what really does this Open Data Directive do is it makes basically an obligation on public sector bodies and public undertakings that they shall make these documents available in format that are open, hopefully, machine readable, and that they comply with the FAIR principles. That's fundability, interoperability, accessibility, and reusability principles. So this is what it does. Now, all of what I said already is going to be somewhat put on steroids and translated into the Data Act. So all I've said, there's going to be like more access mechanism even to a broader scope of data. So not only, so the DGA basically also expands in some ways the principle of the Open Data Directive to a broader set of public sector data and public sector bodies as well. So there is an Open Data Maturity Report in which you can check how much of these data are actually available for you as researchers in your own country. And well, that's pretty much it. So take home is the following. You do have more access rights than you thought you had, thanks to the General Data Protection Regulation, Free Flow Non-Personal Data Regulation, and Open Data Directive. There are problems in the implementation of these mechanisms for access, but still we're getting there. And we see that the trajectory towards the reusability and interoperability of data, thanks to the Data Act and the DGA, is going in the direction to foster, let's say, open data and way of reusing this. So as data scientists, be happy. We've heard your complaints, we've heard your prayers, and we're going there, we promise. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. Now we can open officially the question and answer part. So if any of you has any comment or any question, you know, this is an open forum, so everyone is welcome and encouraged to participate and even sharing their views. Okay, then I will be I will break the ice. Well, actually, I have like a more, I mean, broad question about because we saw on one side, well, okay, of course, Denise, she opened with the GDPRs, but we are already more familiar, let's say, with the GDPR, and now we have all the new directives, and well, in the between, as you said, Tommaso, there are the Open Data Directive and the Free Flow of non-personal information regulation. So, but they all, let's say, share, you know, these in some way or another, try to make the data more usable and reusable and accessible. So my question was more, what are the, besides you have already mentioned, but what are the most critical interconnection or interplay between all these frameworks, what you can say, but still they are connected? What is, you know, the compatibility or the main criticalities that you see when you put them all together and try to make indeed this data more accessible and reusable? It's for both, so.
Kyle, do you want to start? Shall I start?
Sure, I can start.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, well, you kind of mentioned it, but I think the biggest obstacle, at least I've seen, is that this idea of not having some sort of obligation to be compatible is a huge obstacle. Because, like I said, these are competitors in a competitive market who there's a lot of reasons in the digital economy to keep your data secret, to keep users locked into your system and not switching. And that's how the system is developed, particularly. You can look into some of the antitrust issues with that as well. I mean, the competition policy, but the general idea is that these companies are not incentivized to make their data open, and they're not incentivized to allow users to port their data between different areas. And while the GDPR did, you know, created this new idea of the right to portability, it didn't do so in a way that really recognized, I think, the reality of what digital markets look like and what actors' incentives actually will be. It was kind of just a gentle prod that was, you should allow this if they ask, but you know, we're not going to create any firm obligations. Perhaps it was a compromise language at the end of the day, but that's my view on it.
Yeah, so if I can just piggyback on what Kyle already said, so I totally agree with what you just said. There's not much. So economically wise, like research is showing that there have not been even economically incentives. They haven't shown that there's incentives for small and medium enterprises to get access to these portability requests or to respond to these portability requests, let alone for the big giant, big tech markets. No wonder why in the Digital Markets Act, they say, okay, but these portability requests can go only from a bigger player to a smaller player and not the other way around, with obvious competition problems. The competition is all over the place here. The problem with portability is that they failed with portability in GDPR, which had a super small scope in regards to what data could you port and on which basis could you port the data, and also with somewhat very lenient technical specification of commonly used structured machine readable formats. And now you get to the complete other end of the spectrum, where you have the Data Act that says, interoperability of all sorts of services, even talking about commercial interoperability, contractual interoperability, operational. So it really blew up the whole system, and of personal and non-personal data, of entire services, not just the data anymore. We're talking about interoperability of services. So from portability of specific types of data to interoperability of services. And this is kind of like a very much wishful thinking by the European Commission. I'm not sure how they're going to do it. Also because they haven't taken into consideration the market distortions problem, this incentives problem, the technical specifications problem. There's no, like, these codes of conducts were obviously they were a failure. And that's the reason why they had to they threw them out of the window and they came back like a boomerang in Chapter 6 of the Data Act now. And what they did is, instead of like trying to fix the smaller problems that they created before, they created new, bigger problems, even even harder to solve. I have no idea how they're going to try to pull this off.
Thank you very much. Very interesting comments, and it's also very interesting the fact that you say, okay, about you both spoke about the incentives to make this obligation. Indeed, I mean, one of the things is that they speaks more also about rights and obligations, but how to make it that actually to become effective. And one of the aspects also that if I may, to add, that to me it's I mean, as an intellectual property lawyer, I mean, the aspect that I was having a look is then the treatment of the IP rights inside the whole package, and it's not similar, let's say. I mean, even with regards the distinction between confidential information and trade secrets, and well, sometimes they are not the same. Well, they are not actually the same. So how to make them more compatible, let's say, or more harmonized, and say, in the whole system. So then, in fact, one can apply it and can actually, use and access to the data. It's very hard. At least I am in the first incursions, and I am still struggling to understand. So I don't want to steal the time. Maybe there are some that have any other question or other comments. So raise your hand or just speak speak loud. Okay. Well, then if there are no other questions, I think that I thank you again for your participation and for your interesting presentations. Thank you also, Denise, that she had joined us at the beginning, and well, then we will share this presentation on the website and also on YouTube as the previous ones. Thank you very much, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the nice invitation. See you, everyone.
See you. Bye.